Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in Linguistics. This is Pramod Pandey, Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. This is the first module of the paper Advanced Phonology. We begin this course by taking an overview of linear phonology, which we discussed in great detail in paper 2, Introduction to Phonetics and Phonology.
The phonology that has come to be today and that is in use and practice today is mainly non-linear in character. However, sometimes we wrongly assume that linear phonology is somewhat wrong, ill-conceived, and there is nothing of use in it. That is a misconception. We will try to see how some of the insights into the working of language, the organization of language, and the expression of language in various fields and areas has been made possible because of the insights that have come from linear phonology and that are still relevant in the present day discussion of these areas. Note that both structural phonology and standard generative phonology advocate a linear view of phonology, simply because the non-linear view was difficult to sort of take and it required considerable research and discussion and the progress of linear phonology to come to a stage where we could see the inadequacies of linear phonology in explaining certain phenomena. It is for the sake of explaining certain phenomena that the nonlinear phonological understanding of phonological organization came to be. However, there are processes and phenomena which do not require a nonlinear view, where the linear view is in itself of great help in our ability to see how these phenomena work. Today we'll take a look at some of the basic ideas of linear phonology, which continue to guide us even today, so that we don't want to throw them away. Secondly, we want to give a rationale for why we have discussed these theories when the theories also have come to change, because the basis of phonological theory was provided by these theories of structural phonology and standard generative phonology. Let's look at some of these important notions of these theories. The most important notion, it should be apparent, has been the notion of contrast. It is the principles, phonological principles, that help you to arrive at contrasting segments, phonemes, that has clearly shown the significance and the importance of these principles. And in fact, other related disciplines have also taken help of these principles in arriving at the units in those disciplines, such as structural anthropology or structural, let's say, poetics. So the basic principles were outlined in structural phonology. The notion of contrast and the notion of similarity. Now, the notion of contrast has come to grow and develop and guide the progress of phonological and phonetic theories ever since it was proposed. The notion of contrast was taken to phonetics. For example, we have the theory of maximal dispersion, which shows that it is not the case that you can have any, let's say, vowels or consonants occur without any consideration for differences. the theory of maximal dispersion shows that the vocal and the, shall we say, mental organization of speech is such that there has to be some kind of a difference and distinction between them. It is the difference and distinction which determines the organization of sound units. For example, let's take a look at the two inventories of vowels in two languages. One is a 5-vowel system and the other is a 7-vowel system. Now you notice that vowel systems in languages are typically of this kind. You have either a 5-vowel system. If it is 6-vowel, then it is of a certain type, or 7-vowel systems. So you have these well-distanced speech sounds, all well-differentiated speech sounds. The notion of contrast has come to be taken seriously in phonetics thus, and seems to be of considerable psychological importance or cognitive importance. Today's development of cognitive linguistics cannot overlook the importance of the contrast. Somehow, when you look at the phonetics that is being done today and phonology that is being done today, it is the notion of contrast which has come to be challenged. So we have purely phonetic based explanations now, phonetic based descriptions of phenomena which can be described in mathematical terms, and the work in phonology of purely phonetics based phonology, we also know it as laboratory phonology such, or parametric phonology such, that the notion of contrast doesn't seem to be quite relevant. We also have later development known as optimality theory of phonology, where contrasting segments at the underlying representation are not considered to be relevant. So the notion of contrast then has come to be controversial. The question before us is it possible that you have the contrast, the notion of contrast is irrelevant? In fact, on close questioning, we find that it is necessary for us to somehow maintain and explore the notion of contrast in languages. How is it that the notion of contrast finds expression in different languages? There are various issues and problems related to it. We need to take a fresh look at the issues from the point of view of cognition, of the nature of knowledge. Some data, for example, are also of fresh importance to the theory. For example, in structural phonology, the notion of minimal pairs is of critical importance. However, when we look at more and more data, languages, especially endangered languages in India and elsewhere, or languages which have very few speakers, what we find is, because of the limited vocabulary, it is not possible for us to find minimal pairs. And yet, the languages are there, the sounds are there. Now, let's take a look at the sounds or some kind of pairs we find in the language Jarawa, spoken in the Andaman Nicobar Islands. We have three consonants: pa, the bilabial voiceless plosive pa, the voiced bilabial plosive ba, and there is a voiceless bilabial fricative fa. The question is, are these three different, or are they one, and are they related? We have sounds, we have examples of words where these sounds occur, but it is very difficult to find minimal pairs for them to establish, for example, that pa and ba are phonemes. We do have them. For example, word initially we find pa and ba, word finally we find pa and ba, but we have mostly a subminimal pair like aap and lab, but we don't find aap and ab, for example. And similarly, for the voiceless bilabial fricative, we have it occurring in the word medial position in some forms, verbs. Now, but it's very difficult to establish on the basis of the standard method of contrastive distribution and minimal pairs that these are phonemes, and yet the speakers of the language recognize them as independent phonemes. The question, therefore, before us is what exactly is the nature of contrast that is at the basis of cognition in human languages? The conclusion to be drawn from this discussion is that it is in structural phonology, the notion of contrast that was introduced has come to be questioned. However, it is a very useful term, very useful notion. We need to learn more about it, especially its importance in cognition. We cannot take a simple position of throwing it away or simply adhering to it, but we need to critically examine its cognitive importance. The second important issue in linear phonology is one of perception. Somehow, linear phonology was based mostly on articulation of facts. The perception of facts was seen to be a part of intuition. Generative phonology, for example, laid a great deal of emphasis on the importance of how native speakers have developed an intuition of the knowledge of sounds in them. However, the technique for investigating perception and the role of perception is something that was ignored. Not because the phonologists and phoneticians couldn't see the importance of it, but because there were no instrumental methods and techniques for examining perception. Gradually, what is emerging is that perception is as important, perhaps even more important than articulation in determining the knowledge of language. While perception has been ignored, but it needs to be explored on its own term, and there is nothing to suggest that the linear conception of phonology does not help you to look into the importance of perception. Now, to consider some of the examples of the importance of perception, we looked at one of, namely, of rhythm, that is, the difference between stress-timed and syllable-timed rhythm. Phoneticians and phonologists, we saw, have found it questionable to distinguish between these two types of speech rhythm purely on the basis of articulation. And yet, somehow, the difference between the two types of speech rhythm is found. Speakers of one language find that the rhythm of the other language is not the same, is different. Now, perhaps the difference is that at the level of perception. There has been intense research on language acquisition, both first language and second language acquisition. Some of the references are given to you in the Learn More quadrant. When we go through the literature, it appears that the perception of a language plays an even more important role than articulation. We all know that children first perceive sounds only after they have learned to perceive sounds that they begin to articulate. It is also so in second language acquisition. And studies show that if the learners can perceive a distinction, then they can also produce a distinction. If the learners cannot perceive a distinction, then they cannot produce a distinction. This is a kind of position that seems to be well attested on the basis of research studies. So we need to develop ways and means of examining perception in languages. That is, how perception plays a role in linguistic knowledge. There is an area of phonology, contact phonology, that has not been addressed by these linear theories, although the area is explorable using the notions, using the principles of linear phonology. Let's take a look at some examples that are of interest to phonology and which come from contact phonology studies. The questions that they raise are as important to linguistics as questions that result from the study of phonological processes in individual languages. Take, for example, the case of borrowings in languages from other languages. For example, English, which is a global language, is constantly giving words to other languages of the world. We have a large number of borrowings from English into some Indic languages such as Hindi and Telugu, for example. Now, when we look at the borrowings of English into Hindi and Telugu, we find that for words having alveolar plosives ta and da, Hindi and Telugu have two possible sets. That is, both the languages have dental and retroflex sets, but not alveolar sets. So, when we get alveolar consonants from English, the possibility is that Hindi and Telugu will substitute either the dental for the alveolar or the retroflexes for the alveolar. Both are equidistant. Remember that the dental, we have the place organization like dental, alveolar, post-alveolar, retroflexes. So alveolar is as close or far from dental as it is from retroflexes. Now so the possibility is that you can have either dental or retroflexes. But in reality, what we find is that both the languages, Telugu and Hindi, both the languages substitute retroflex consonants for the alveolar consonants and not dental consonants. So when we look at examples such as table, desk, tiger, dog, the borrowings in Telugu and Hindi, both the languages are they both have retroflex stops such as table and desk and tiger and dog. So we do not hear these words being pronounced as table and desk and tiger and dog. So we don't get these dental sounds. Although both languages have dental as well as retroflex consonants. The question is that we ask is, how is it that only one set of sounds substitutes the sounds of English and not the other? What is the explanation possible? Now please remember that this is a question which does not need a distinction between linear phonology and non-linear phonology. The principles and basic concerns of linear phonology also are related to these questions of what determines, let us say, the selection of sounds in contact phonology, in loan phonology. Another issue that is of importance in loan phonology, contact phonology, and an issue which has not really been of interest in the studies using structural phonology and classical generative phonology is an example such as this. Let us say in Hindi we have a rule which says the voiced retroflex consonant da becomes a flap. This is also a general rule in a lot of Indic languages. So that the context is between two vowels. Between two vowels in Hindi, let us say, you do not hear a d but a r. For example, we say ghoda or ghadi or peda. Now, ghoda means horse, ghadi means clock, and peda is a kind of sweets. There is a second context, another context where the change takes place, that is word final. So we say paid, for example, is ra occurs at the end of words. Now this is a general rule, no exceptions for cases in Hindi, for example. So if you find a d occurring between two vowels, it will be pronounced as ra. If you find a d occurring at the end of words alone, it will be pronounced as ra. However, when we look at borrowings in Hindi from English, then we find that this rule is not attested. So Hindi speakers pronounce words such as soda or road. They don't make a soda and road. Now the question that arises is, what is the cognitive significance of this? Why is it, how is it that speakers of Hindi keep the two phonological rules apart? Is there any principles that explain the organization of sounds in two different ways? Remember that there is no difference in the conception of phonology being linear or non-linear in representation. These issues are as much relevant to linear phonology as to non-linear phonology. The distinction between two theories is of no great consequence in addressing this question. What is being pointed out is that there are new areas which are emerging and which can be explored using the notions and principles that you have been introduced to in this course. An important area that occupies the interests of phonologists today started off quite early in phonology. Its basis was the Prague School Phonology, and it was proposed as an important area of study in the sound pattern of English by Chomsky and Hale. The notion is of markedness. Chomsky and Hale in their book Chapter 9 talk about the importance of markedness and how if they had explored the notion of markedness, then perhaps they would have arrived at explanations of many phenomena differently. The notion of markedness simply says that there are two kinds of regularities. One appears to be more common, more general, more natural. This is a regularity that is unmarked, that is more common. You can have statistical generalizations based on this. And you have other regularities which are less frequent, but yet which are found in natural languages, which are marked. Now, the difference between the two is that somehow there is a kind of let's say, movement perhaps from maybe the marked to the unmarked. There could also be pressures which prevent such a movement from the marked to the unmarked. That is, languages continue to work with marked phenomena. To give examples of the difference between markedness, between marked and unmarked phenomena, when we look at, let us say, vowels, we find that between front vowels and back vowels, it is back vowels which are more or which are rounded in general. So U, O, front vowels E, A are not rounded. There are languages such as French and German where the front vowels are also rounded, so you get U, etc. But when we look at the distribution of sounds of the vowels in world languages, you find that U and U are marked phenomena, or marked cases. So this is a simple example of markedness. Front rounded vowels are marked, back front unrounded vowels are unmarked. We have certain other phenomena certain other generalizations too, where it is very easy for us to see the difference between unmarked and marked sounds. For example, sonorants in most languages are always voiced. So if we get voiceless sonorants, then they are marked. Voiceless sonorants are marked. So the notion of markedness helps us to look at the phenomena, processes, aspects of the organization of phonological knowledge in terms of markedness and, let us say, marked and unmarked units of sounds. The notion of markedness has played a crucial role in the development of linguistic theory. It is not only phonology, but we find the notion permeating the whole discipline of linguistics, such as semantics or syntax or morphology as well. Within phonology, the notion of markedness has played a very crucial role. It was introduced by structural phonology. It was also proposed by standard generative phonology, and it was the main notion which led to the development of phonology by taking a critical look at some of these principles and tenets of structural phonology and classical generative phonology. Two main theories need to be mentioned here in support of what has just been said. One is the theory of natural phonology by David Stamp. David Stamp argued, and in a very influential manner, he argued that when we look at how languages are acquired, then we find that there is a certain relationship between the first state of language, that is when the child begins to acquire language, and the end state of language, when the child has acquired a language. At the earliest stage, it is mostly the unmarked phenomena which are found in the mind brain of the language. So that when a child learns a language, he is actually unlearning some of these unmarked phenomena, unmarked facts of language, and thus he comes to acquire a language. David Stamp's theory of natural phonology was instrumental in putting a stop to shall we say, the extension of linguistic representations to allow very, very abstract representations. Very abstract representations could be seen to be highly marked, not common, not found in world languages, and at least is raised the question of what is natural language and how much of abstractness is possible. The second important influence of the notion of markedness is found in the present-day optimality theory, which has emerged as a dominant theory of phonology, as well as of other components of grammar, certainly morphology, and to some extent syntax. Optimality theory assumes that it is not phonological rules but phonological constraints which play a crucial role in relating the phonetic form to the underlying form. However, the constraints are mainly of two types: markedness and they call faithfulness constraints. Faithfulness constraints are those which propel or which guide, which influence the speaker to continue to produce sounds, to produce words, to produce linguistic units that may be marked, whereas markedness principles show that there are concerns for constraints that are either marked or unmarked. Normally, when a constraint is violated, it is in favor of unmarked sounds, unmarked outputs. So the notion of markedness was proposed to emphasize the point in structural phonology and in the standard generative phonology, and it continues to hold our interest today. Again, to emphasize, this is to show the relevance of the topics that have been covered in this course on Introduction to Phonetics and Phonology. What you have studied is relevant even today, and there are many issues and topics and problems that can be addressed on the basis of some of these principles and ideas and notions that you have been introduced to. Now to a major problem in linear phonology. One major problem of linear phonology was that it came to lay heavy emphasis on rules and gave less importance to representation. Phonological rules were important because the way the rules are stated, the orderings amongst the rules, all help the theory to achieve the goals of arriving at simple grammars and of explaining the knowledge of the native speaker in as elegant and simple a way as possible. However, the emphasis on rules was exaggerated. That is, there was an attempt at trying to explain almost any phonological process in terms of rules which are based on linear sequencing of sounds. There are some certain phenomena, there were certain problems which could not be explained in terms of the linear conception. That is one. Secondly, if you try to account for everything in terms of rules, then there is a certain danger of having any kind of rules possible and of having any kind of underlying representation possible. You can propose an underlying certain units in the underlying representation which can be changed to the phonetic representation by devising certain rules. So if you put all the emphasis on phonological rules, then the danger is that you can propose any kind of underlying forms and relate it to the actual phonetic form. Whether the units in the underlying form are psychologically real or not is of no issue. Thus, you come to question whether this truly explains the knowledge of the native speaker hearer of the sounds of the language. In order to put a certain restriction to hold the growth of phonology in this manner, that is, to propose any kind of units as part of the underlying representation, it became necessary for phonology to re-examine, to shift the emphasis from phonological rules to phonological representations. And it is essentially the change in the conception of phonological representations that helped us balance the relationship between phonological representations and phonological rules. This is something that we will take a look at only in a course on advanced phonology. In the present module, we take a look at the linear phonological models that were proposed in structural phonology and in standard generative phonology. The point of discussion here is the fact that although phonological theory has come to be revised in terms of many of its basic tenets, the theory that was in use both in structural phonology and in classical generative phonology is still relevant. So what we know about speech sounds from the methods and techniques and concepts of structural phonology and classical generative phonology in terms of linear phonological representations are still in use. There are certain phenomena, there are certain problems which the linear phonological theory can still address and find solution to in an interesting way. Your training in this area can still be of use if you apply it to addressing certain problems and issues that were ignored in these theories at an earlier stage. Our interests are changing, the linguistic data are emerging new, and the basic methods and principles of linear phonology are still usable. There are, of course, problems with linear phonology, which we need to address, and that is why we have an advanced course on phonology planned for you. But let's take a look at what kinds of problems are still relevant to a linear theory of phonology and where there is need for it to change.